You're listening to How India's Economy Works, hosted by journalist and author Pooja Mehra.
Hello, I'm Pooja Mehra. The one request I receive most often from listeners is for episodes on the 1991 reforms. Young listeners want to know what's the big deal about them. Not so young listeners want to know why India hasn't ever managed to repeat the success. Covering everything about the 1991 reforms will take several episodes. For a start, we have on the show today Dr. Shruti Rajagopalan, who leads a project that has recorded hundreds of hours of interviews with nearly 50 actors involved in various capacities with the 1991 reforms. Shruti is a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, where she leads the Indian Political Economy program. She also hosts the Ideas of India podcast. Hi, Shruti. Thank you for coming on the show.
Hi, Pooja. It's so good to be here. I've been a fan of your writing for so long that I'm so excited to speak with you.
Likewise. I'm a fan of your writing and your podcast. I know that you're doing this great project on the 1991 reforms, large work of recording oral histories with the main characters and actors involved in the reforms. And I'll come to that. But before I come to that project that you're doing, I want you to tell my listeners today what your personal experience of the license Raj pre 1991 was. You've written extensively about it. So most of my listeners who were young, who weren't around before 1991, and therefore they don't know how various policies impacted and how it showed up in everyday life and business, and then how it changed.
This is not one of those stories where you say, oh, in our time, we walked to school 5 kilometers every day and studied under a roadside lamp. This is all actually quite factual and people can look it up. I was born in the early to mid 80s. And when you're a kid, like let's say between 5 and 10, you don't question what's happening around you too much, right? You just feel like whatever is happening around you is the way it is. You go to the ration shop, there's a long line, right? That's just how it's always been. You know that to make a long distance call, if you have your grandparents living in Chennai while we were living in Delhi, you have to book what was called a trunk call, right? This was an interstate long distance call. And you know that there's a lot of rush, so you have to do it in off peak hours. And you have to basically call an operator and book something in advance. And then, they'll connect and you'll get a call back at like 11:45 at night and you'll be able to talk to your grandparents. So we didn't think differently about it. In fact, the first 5 years of my life, I didn't have a phone. Apparently, my parents had put in a request for one, but they didn't get the allotment until I was age 5. So we used the phone, in our neighbor's place. My grandparents, my mother's parents lived about 5 minutes away, and things like that. So again, never questioned this too much.
Oh, yes. My grandparents' place, all the people in the neighborhood, they had given my grandparents' phone numbers to all of their relatives outside of Delhi. And sometimes my grandparents would have to write small slips saying so and so will call at such and such time because there were multiple calls coming. So they were, like a mini exchange for the neighborhood.
Absolutely. So my grandparents kind of played that function, but the other function was played by the local Kirana store, who also turned into someone, who'd receive calls and you'd pay 4 rupees and you could make a call and, so on. I mean, we were relatively privileged middle class children, not really wanting for anything. So you don't think too much about these things, right? But let me give you another example of my childhood, which is like, bicycle. So most of us who were born in the 80s, we never got new shiny bikes unless you were very rich, right? So it's a hand-me-down or, some third cousin of yours has been using it, then some second cousin, then your older sibling, then the middle sibling, then it finally passes on to you. And today, when I tell younger folks, my younger cousins, my nieces and nephews, depending on the decade they were born, the answer is different, So if they were born in the 90s and I asked them, how did you get your first bike? They say, oh, we just went to the store and, we drove around a couple of options and we bought one. If you ask the post-2000 kids, they basically say, oh, you just order one online. But if you ask, let's say, my father, who was born in the 50s, my parents, how they got that first bike, which eventually became a hand-me-down, their story is a little bit different and it's directly linked to India's economic policy. Basically, there were massive shortages for something as basic as a bicycle. And I'm picking a bicycle because, this is something every generation has used. Unlike a trunk call or, ration shop or something, we've all ridden bikes in our channel. So my dad, it was the same thing. Like there was a long wait and a second-hand bike had to be bought. So when you ask, why wasn't he just able to purchase a regular bike? Like, were they broke? Were they poor? Was there a problem? What was going on? So, you first figure out, oh, there was a shortage of bikes, right? And again, to today's young people, if you say there's a shortage, they'll say, oh, why isn't like some startup figuring out how to start making bikes or importing bikes from abroad? And that's a very reasonable question, right? But couldn't someone just start a bike company and start making bikes? Well, actually, no. This is what we call the industrial licensing system. So this goes back to the idea of socialism, the idea that the market does not allocate resources properly and there's a lot of wastage because there's wasteful and frivolous competition, right? So if multiple bike companies are competing with each other, that's considered wasteful resources. So we don't want that kind of competition. The second part of the thinking was that markets also don't allocate equitably, right? So one is an efficiency and waste related argument. The other is, only rich people will get the bikes, regular folks, middle class folks, poor kids won't get the bike. And do you really want a rich parent buying a bike for a 9-year-old kid as opposed to a poor daily wage laborer who needs it to get to his livelihood or, needs to get it to go to the mechanic shop? So that was the thinking behind this. So now they say, okay, we're only going to have a few bike companies because we don't want wasteful expenditure, right? And wasteful competition. So now you limit the number of people who can start the bike company. The whole system begins here.
You want to give preference to capital intensive industries.
So you're so right. It's so tightly linked to that. So it's linked to bicycles in a slightly tangential way. So let's say you need to start a bike shop. What do you need to do? You're in an industrial licensing system where the government will decide how large your firm can be, where it can be located, what kind of technology it can use, how much output it will produce, what will be the employment to capital ratio, what will be the size of investment, and so on and so forth. So it's extraordinary how many details were fixed. Now, let's say that you are lucky and you got this license. Okay, so you are one of the lucky few entrepreneurs who got it. Now, the other part of it was, which you just alluded to, that the Nehruvian vision was we're not going to be a country of petty labor. The idea was that we will be a very sophisticated, extremely industrialized economy, which will be modern. And the focus was capital industry because, again, resources are scarce. And the Nehruvian point of view was regular industry like bicycles, we can rely on the private sector. But for heavy industry, right, iron and steel and things like that, aluminum, we need to make sure that the government invests in this. So now the thing is, iron and steel and aluminum were completely government owned and controlled. I think Tisco was the only exception, and that's because it predates the government, the Union of India, right? It was grandfathered in.
And, ironically, it's the first integrated steel plant in all of Asia. And they were the biggest suppliers to the British during the World Wars.
Exactly. And, of course, there were connections and, J.R.D. Tata and Nehru had a relationship. So they got grandfathered in, but no one could start a new iron and steel industry. This was just reserved only for the government, right? So now, how does this link to my dad's bicycle problem? Now, you need inputs, right? You need steel, you need iron, you need aluminum. All of this is centrally controlled. So when the government says that we're going to control iron and steel, what that actually means, in nuts and bolts, sorry for the pun, but what that actually means, in a working system is they're going to decide how much quantity of iron and steel is produced, what quality will be produced, and where it will be allocated. Because, from a safety pin to heavy industry to bicycle to eyeglasses to surgical medical equipment, you need steel. Now, they are going to decide what kind of grade of steel and how much will be produced. So now a bicycle manufacturer, by the way, who already managed to get the license to set up the bicycle shop, now needs a permit to get the steel allocation. And then the same thing for aluminum and the same thing for everything else that goes into a bicycle. Sorry, I'm not familiar with the details of how a bicycle is made to the last point. Now you may say, again, when I talk to young people, and this is literally my experience in the classroom, they're like, couldn't they just import it? Well, not exactly, because part of the system was, some of it is colonial hangover, some of it is the Soviet experiment that India was kind of trying out. But India decided to be an autarkic state, which means that it wouldn't expose itself to global trade. And here we can't really blame, just Nehru and the central planners, the orthodox view at the time very much was that developing countries should be protectionist. They need to protect their own infant industries and so on and have import substitution. And developed countries can be part of the free trade environment because they can handle the competition. So now there are three policies which are linked. One is import substitution. That is, you're going to have very, very high tariffs and you're going to protect local industries, which is TISCO and the government-owned iron and steel industries. The second part of it is that you're going to have import licenses. Now, even after all this, there are going to be some things which obviously India does not produce or India does not have a natural endowment. So you're allowed to import it, but you need to go back to Commerce Ministry and you need to get an import license specific to import that good. And separately, there's a foreign exchange shortage because the rupee was overvalued, which means you need to get a separate foreign exchange allocation, right? And that will be an amount that is given to you for a particular use and you can't use it for any other use. So now we know that you have to wait in line outside the government or TISCO's shop to get your iron and steel. You can't import it, right? So now what ends up happening? And by the way, I'm so far still talking about a single input for a bicycle. I'm just talking about the metal. Right now, there are so many other inputs that go in. I mean, there is coal that is required. There's electricity that is required. You need telephone lines to actually communicate with different parts of the enterprise and so on. I'm not even looking at all that. I'm looking at one product, which is a regular bicycle, and I'm looking at one input for that one product. So this is the extent or the detail to which this was done. Now, consequence of all this craziness is basically you can't produce enough bikes. Because first, you don't have enough people entering the bike manufacturing system. And even the ones who enter are restrained, at a permit and license level for every single thing. And we're not, by the way, I'm also not talking about credit, which was controlled, right? Because at some point nationalized all these banks. So I'm just talking about a very limited amount. So as a consequence, bicycles there was an extreme shortage. India's demographic was becoming younger in post-colonial terms. It was urbanizing. Young men looking for work or moving to urban areas started using a bicycle. It's not your grandfather's story of we walked 5 kilometers to go to school. My father's story is we bicycled 5 kilometers to school. That's where we are, right? Now, we know, Econ 101 is if your supply is not going to be able to respond to this increased demand for bicycles, the prices are going to shoot up. But in a socialist economy, we can't let a private bicycle manufacturer profit from the system. How is that allowed? Which means, in addition to all of these controls, you have price controls. So you have controlled the price and quantity of every single input. You have both deliberately and inadvertently controlled the output, which is bicycle. And now you have to control the price of bicycles. So this is where we've reached. Now, it got crazier and crazier. This wasn't there, I'm pretty sure this wasn't there in my time, but I think still in my dad's time, because there was this bicycle, control. There was a shortage and then there was a price control. The government wanted to make sure that all the available bicycles were used, right? So no one's just buying a bicycle and keeping it at home and saying, I'll ride for exercise 1 hour in the evening, which meant that after you managed to acquire this bicycle, owning and riding the bicycle required a government issued token or a little permit, which you needed to renew every year, right? If you didn't renew it, then your traffic cop could catch you. Because now, only so many bicycles in the economy, right? So we have to optimize and utilize. Utilization was a very big thing that you would find. And now because of this, by the time we get to 91, in the 80s, there was what they called broadbanding. Which basically said that, if you're making men's bicycles, now you can also make children's bicycles and you don't need an additional permit for that. So they allowed, these kinds of minor things in the late 80s. So by the time I was born and I was growing up, it was a little bit easier to get a bicycle. But my older sister, my older cousins, they all got this as hand-me-downs from each other. And, it's literally like it became a family heirloom. And nobody thinks of a bicycle as a family heirloom. So this was sort of life before 91. And also, bicycle again feels like a very, oh, you're a kid, you want a bicycle. But, even basic things like poor people struggled outside ration shops to get their rice and kerosene and dal, all the most basic things.
Today, even rich people, I mean, the kind of mountains you had to move if you wanted to buy a car.
Oh, wow. Yes. So my family's first car was a second-hand car.
Most people. But if it was, God forbid, an imported,
Oh, yeah.
like a Mercedes or something.
Oh,
you
yeah.
had
That's
it.
like, God knows, 200% tariffs or something like that, right?
Yeah, and then there were these agencies that were allowed only to import it, and you had to get it out of their, quota. And so it was not just for poor people or middle class people.
Yeah. No, and I'll give you a middle class example, which is the Bajaj scooter, right? The Bajaj scooter was, if there was a marker for middle class living, it was the Bajaj scooter and like a Godrej almari, right? These were like sort of some of, these literally came in dowry when someone got married. Same thing happened with the Bajaj scooter. Rahul Bajaj wanted, expansion permit because demand was increasing. He didn't get the expansion permit. Every single other thing that I said about bicycles is also true for the Bajaj scooter. Now, the price of the Bajaj scooter is going up constantly, right? But you can't increase the price because the price is also controlled. So what happens is a second-hand Bajaj scooter, which is available immediately, that is available today, is more expensive than a first-hand brand new Bajaj scooter, which will be available 2 years from today.
It's also true of Maruti cars. My father sold his second-hand Maruti car for more than what he had bought it after using it for 8 years.
Exactly. So basically, see, markets are going to come up somewhere. If there is a demand for it, you're going to create a black market or an informal market or something. So we create a second-hand market. And at one point, this was literally a joke, right? So again, in the Indian system, you can really extract something very big when you're getting married if you're the boy's side and demanding dowry. So this Maruti car, Bajaj scooter, Godrej almari, these sorts of things which were very sort of high demand, high preference goods, but again, same shortage problem as the rest of the economy, like nuts and bolts and kerosene. They started becoming dowry demands because you can't refuse. So the joke eventually became, past a point, it became like an 8 or 9 year wait for a Bajaj scooter, like a regular Bajaj scooter. And when a daughter was born, people would come and say congratulations and tell the father, please book the Bajaj scooter today. By the time she's old enough to get married, you'll get your allotment. And by the way, all this, most of the instances I'm narrating are in my lifetime. Maybe not that bicycle token, which was my dad's lifetime, but this Bajaj scooter, the second-hand Maruti, this is all happening in the 80s still. Waiting 5-6 years for a telephone line, all of this was going on in my lifetime. And because of this, as you pointed out, basically the economy just stagnated, right? You're artificially strangling any kind of growth that can take place because all the growth has to be tightly controlled and only allowed by the government. So now anything that can be done outside of the government is either going to be driven into the smuggling market, informal market. Today, when we think about bootleggers and smugglers, it's mainly to do with drugs. Or if you're in a prohibition state like Gujarat and Bihar, then maybe alcohol. In our times, like a Walkman, you needed to know a smuggler contact to get a Sony Walkman, which is how we got our, or like
Adidas shoes.
Sneakers, Adidas shoes, exactly. So these are the sorts of things, now these seem pretty basic and some of this seems like a middle class gripe of, how hard it was to get like something basic. But the larger implication of this is people want things in an economy. The entrepreneurs are willing to provide it. And there is a entire sort of scaffolding of licenses, permits, controls, credit, foreign exchange, control, licensing, all of this stuff just kind of built a scaffolding around what could have grown or what could have been built or what could have happened. And only things which were outside that system managed to have even a little bit of growth or which were completely, done and controlled by the state. This legacy is not just Nehru. Some of it goes to war controls, right? Wartime controls, they started like in the late 30s, early 40s. And when India, gained independence, they just continued those controls because wartime controls actually translate pretty well into central planning, which is what, India was trying to implement. And Then when Indira Gandhi came to power, she wanted this kind of planning not just for a simple set of price, quantity, foreign exchange controls. She also wanted to capture what in Soviet terms was called, the commanding heights of the economy. So, all your most important input industries, which is, mining, credit, insurance, the backbone of any functioning economy, she decided that those things should also belong and come under government purview. So one by one, we went down this road. And of course, none of this works because you're not producing enough, which means you're not raising enough tax revenue, but you're also socialist as a point of view, which means you need to spend a fair bit to keep poor people in some basic essential welfare entitlements and endowments. You need to build schools. So to build anything, the government needs revenue. And revenue is a percentage of what is produced and sold, right? So if you completely contract the economy to such an extent, what that means is either the government can say, okay, we're not going to do anything, right? We're just not going to give anything to anyone. We're not going to build roads. We're not going to build schools. We're not going to give rations to poor people. Well, one, they'll lose elections. And two, if you're a non-democratic state, you'll have riots because the entire promise of socialism is that that will be delivered, right? Which means the government essentially got into a spending problem. So you're not raising enough money. I don't say produce because the government actually doesn't produce anything. Though in socialist time, they were producing everything from Lodi Hotel to modern bakery bread to everything, right? But they're not able to raise enough revenue to keep any of this afloat. Plus, because you own all these public sector enterprises, which are not dictated by market forces and a profit motive, they are basically the most inefficient places, right? So nobody gets fired. It doesn't matter how costly it was to produce, a loaf of modern bakery bread or how expensive it is to upkeep Lodi Hotel. The government's just going to pay it even if there aren't enough people demanding rooms or willing to pay the room rate, which would justify that kind of expense in that location. So between the socialist welfare spending and the government inefficiency, deficits went out of control. And we can have a conversation about all the crazy things we used to do, like automatic monetization of deficit and, things like that. But basically, government has a spending problem. The rupee weakens, but you can't let the rupee weaken too much because your imports will become too expensive, which you're already trying to control. So you artificially keep the rupee overvalued, which means you need to put in more controls for anyone who's trying to do anything in the external sector. So, this thing, I keep repeating it because it's literally everything is linked to everything in an economy and it just keeps going round and round. And then one or two things need to happen for this entire thing to unravel completely. And incidentally, in the Indian case, it was oil prices shooting up, right? Oil was one of the biggest imports for India, and India used a pretty large amount of its, foreign exchange was just reserved to buy oil and energy. And by the end of 1989, in the 70s, we know we had, oil shock and prices rose, which also led to some major problems. But in 1989, when no one expected it, suddenly there was another oil shock, and this was because of the Gulf War. So prices suddenly start going up, which means your oil import bill rather, just doubles and trebles in what is already a dire situation. You already have very high inflation because your deficits are now going up. So, you have double-digit deficits, you have double-digit inflation. And what that does is basically your economy is not as well rated anymore and the rupee is not as well rated externally anymore. What that basically means is no one wants to do business with you. No one will accept a piece of paper which says that the Indian rupee is valued at whatever you say it's valued at, right? No one actually trusts that. So this is what happened by the late 80s. So this all came to bear. So, even before this, to be honest, in the 60s, there was a view that maybe we need to devalue the currency and not go in this direction. But there were a number of political issues. Indira Gandhi came to power. She was advised by a number of very, very socialist, extreme left of center people like P.N. Haksar. Also, she was trying to differentiate herself from the rest of the party and trying to gain power. So, there was a slightly more pro-market, pro-liberalizing wing of the party, and Indira Gandhi decided to go the other way. So in 1966, when there was a Bell mission, there was a possibility, a tiny possibility that India might actually start decontrolling a little bit, liberalize, adjust its currency a little bit. That never happened. But in 1989, things were really dire. And what are you going to do?
So now we have some understanding of how the economy was and what triggered the 1991 crisis. There are many other things, some of which I think listeners would be aware of, the political crisis, etc. And then what was done to slowly begin to fix this and how it links to each one of these examples that you've given.
So you also talked about the political crisis. So, in 1989, Rajiv Gandhi lost the election, right? He was like a big front runner. He had won by huge majority when he had actually come to parliament. But between the Bofors scam and a number of other things and sort of like a stagnating and a messy economy, high inflation, all the things we talked about, Rajiv Gandhi actually loses the election and VP Singh manages to stitch together a coalition. It's the strangest coalition supported by communists and BJP peoples, the far left, far right, everyone kind of stitches together this coalition. Now, VP Singh is actually quite an interesting person. And now, when we talk to some of the people who worked with him, was apparently very open-minded. I wouldn't go so far as to call him pro-market or pro-reform minded, but clearly there was a reckoning that something had gone horribly wrong. And the promise that was made to the Indian people of economic prosperity and rising out of what their parents and grandparents had suffered in colonial times had really not been delivered. So he was quite open and he was open to ideas and, thought that he could maybe be the person who gets India out of this crisis. And there were also people in his government who started working on putting together something, that would help eventually get India out of the crisis. In fact, Montek Singh Ahluwalia's famous M document was written during this time of VP Singh's government. I believe it was even introduced as a cabinet note and so on. But VP Singh spent a lot of his political capital trying to get caste-based OBC reservations. This was based on the Mandal Committee report. So this was, again, India was rioting, middle class, upper caste people were rioting, as well as Dalits were rioting, saying that, they shouldn't take our share of the pie. So they decided to go with the Mandal formula of, you will have your scheduled caste reservation, you'll introduce, there was scheduled tribe reservation, and now 27% reservations will be introduced for other backward classes. But this was something on which VP Singh spent pretty much all his political capital and couldn't quite get the reforms done, right? And also was unable to deal with, communal riots. There were so many things going on, in 1989. It was just a crazy year. And this instability led to a next government being formed within a year. VP Singh's government barely lasted 11 months, right? So Chandrasekhar comes and he forms another minority government. Now, this government was actually incidentally with the support of Congress, which was led by Rajiv Gandhi. Rajiv Gandhi decided that they'll support it from outside. And his finance minister was Yashwant Sinha, right? Who later also served under Vajpayee, as we know. But this time, Yashwant Sinha had a tiny, really short tenure as finance minister. And he also was market oriented and had decided that, we need to figure out a plan that will actually address all these different problems. We need to cut the fiscal deficit like in a very serious way. We need to think about what's going on with the currency and, reevaluate or rather devalue the currency. And we need to figure out a bunch of other, economic policies which will bring some kind of macroeconomic stability. In fact, I believe later in his memoirs, Yashwant Sinha wrote that whatever Manmohan Singh announced many months later in 1991, there were very similar policies that were already in play that he was thinking of doing and so on. But again, this government didn't have enough, political and social capital to do any of this. There were some other crazy things that were going on. Rajiv Gandhi pulled support from the government. But meanwhile, the only thing that Yashwant Sinha managed to do was secure a loan from agencies abroad to get enough reserves to actually pay the import bill, right? So this was now such a dire situation that, you don't, imagine a family that doesn't have money to buy rations for dinner day after tomorrow. There's enough food today. There's some food tomorrow, but day after, we have absolutely no money left, right? So I believe the number was we had enough reserves, foreign exchange reserves, which are dollar denominated, to buy about 40 days worth of imports at that current run rate. So, there was a plan that there's going to be some economic reforms. We're going to talk to the IMF. We're going to try and get a loan and so on. But Sinha was running out of options. There were no reforms done. So basically, he sold some of India's gold. And now this, I think, an average person understands. If you need to sell gold, which is literally, family heirlooms, to make sure that you can buy enough oil or kerosene to survive the next week or the next month.
Run the kitchen fires.
Exactly. So that was exactly the one-on-one parallel for India, which is you need to start selling gold from India. Meanwhile, the government falls as an interim government. There is a major sort of political campaign that's unfolding, and Rajiv Gandhi gets assassinated. This happens in Tamil Nadu. This is the LTTE planned assassination. And suddenly, India is in disarray, right? Because we've had two very short-lived coalition governments. We've had caste-related riots, communal riots. You've had a major political assassination by what then came to be known as a terrorist group. And you have an economic crisis that has never been seen before in post-colonial India. So that was sort of the situation. And now the Congress party won the maximum number of seats, but not enough for its majority. And there's no clear successor to Rajiv Gandhi. So there's some nice, interesting political history to this. There are a number of books written, especially, Vinay Sitapathi's biography of P.V. Narasimha Rao. And P.V. Narasimha Rao, who's been a very long time congressman, he's been a chief minister, he's been a Lok Sabha member, he's been a foreign minister under Rajiv Gandhi's government and so on. So, sort of one of those long time Indian politicians and parliamentarians becomes what they call a compromise candidate, to lead this minority cup. And Rao is sworn in. And I believe his first thought was to get I.G. Patel as his finance minister. And, he was sort of looking into it. But I.G. Patel was already very senior by then. And I think he was retiring from political and technocratic life. And I believe I.G. Patel and a couple of others suggested Dr. Manmohan Singh as the finance minister candidate to P.V. Narasimha Rao to really arrest this crisis. And some of this also came from the bureaucratic ranks. Naresh Chandra, who was his cabinet secretary as soon as he took office, apparently he asked Naresh Chandra, is the economic situation that bad? When he was briefed on all this. And apparently Naresh Chandra said, no, sir, it's actually much worse in what you've been told. So there was an immediate understanding that the first thing that needs to be done is to arrest this crisis. Otherwise, the Indian currency, the rupee will default, basically. So that was the idea. Now, the most interesting thing that Narasimha Rao managed to do was actually find the right people. We rarely associate economic crisis as an HR problem. Step one of Narasimha Rao was actually, what is the team? This is an HR problem. Who's going to be in which part of the government? And a second part is, even though there was a reckoning, Montague's M document had been doing the rounds, right? There had been multiple reports since the late 70s, and we can get in more into that, where government report after government report had said, we need to deregulate cement, we need to deregulate sugar, we need to deregulate this, we need to liberalize trade. But they were all scattered all over the place. But there was an increasing awakening within the bureaucratic and technocratic class that something, needs to be done. But the entire political class and half the bureaucratic class, the seniors, were still the old socialist guard, right? You can't do anything too drastic. And that's why I say part of it was an HR problem. Because if you get the same old people, you're going to repeat the same old policies. You'll make the same old mistakes, right? And here, now you have Manmohan Singh, who is, by the time, we know Manmohan Singh since he became finance minister. But even before he became finance minister, he was very, very well known and regarded because he had spent time in India. He had spent time abroad at the multilateral organizations. He had a PhD from Oxford, right? He had written, in fact, on trade and imports with Ian Little and so on.
He was chief economic advisor. He was RBI governor.
He was RBI governor, deputy governor, chief economic advisor, planning commission. He had held every important technocratic position in government before he became a cabinet level appointee. And, Manmohan Singh stitched together a team, and the team is really interesting. Now, A.N. Verma was the, Prime Minister's personal secretary. Then you have Naresh Chandra, who's cabinet secretary. And you have some very interesting people now, right? So P. Chidambaram, who was, till then relatively more involved in Tamil Nadu politics, was now going to be the commerce minister, and joined by Montague Singh Ahluwalia, right? Who had written this MDoc, who was a proponent of trade liberalization, who Manmohan Singh knew from, the old days when they were in Washington, D.C. And in fact, apparently, it was Dr. Singh who had encouraged them to move back to India and serve with government. So you had Rakesh Mohan, who had already been at, the industry ministry for many years by then, right? So one by one, you start seeing you have Ashok Desai, right, who is not exactly chief economic advisor because that position wasn't vacant, but he was like the consultant position that had been created for, the chief economic advisor. So one by one, you start seeing this very interesting group of people. And C. Rangarajan is deputy governor at RBI. Right, you have Venkati Ramanan, who is, the governor of RBI. So this team starts coming together in a very, very interesting way. And we've also heard, we've pulled together from different sources that, Dr. Singh, who we know as a very courteous, very polite person, was actually also very strong-willed. When he had his first meeting with that big team of technocrats and bureaucrats, he said, if you have any difficulty with the proposed reform program, we can find other things for you to do, which is again an HR problem, right? We can move you to a ministry where you're not going to be such a pain. We can move you to rural development or something. But in industry, commerce, finance, you need people who are sort of liberal-minded, so to speak. So this was what was going on. So the absolute number one thing that was done, and this was done within a few days of taking office, was the devaluation, right? So this was really, really important. The rupee actually needed to reflect its true value to be taken seriously by anyone who was willing to trade with, others on the rupee. So the first thing was the devaluation. And this devaluation was done in an interesting way. They decided that the rupee was overvalued by, say, about, 20%. And we need to devalue the rupee in some, reasonable way. If you do all 20% at, in one shot, or maybe more than 20% in one shot, the markets will go in the toilet and the world will overreact and the rupee is going to have a different kind of crisis. So the plan was that, there'll be a two-step devaluation program. And of course, devaluation and these things are managed by the RBI. So, the RBI and finance ministry work in tandem, but not everything is actually done and controlled by the finance ministry. This was entirely the RBI's domain. So they had put together, Dr. Singh had, put together a plan. There was a handwritten note sent to Narasimha Rao that, there's going to be this two-step devaluations, things like that. And on July 1st, right, they'd taken office in, end June, within under 10 days, within 8 days, I think, of taking office and being sworn in, he devalued the rupee by about 7 to 9%, right? This is mostly back channels and it happened.
Probably difficult for people to imagine. See, Dr. Rangarajan writes in his memo, which just came out last year, that every day in the morning he used to set the rupee exchange rate because it is not a floating currency.
And that's also not easy, right? Because you got to pull together a bunch of different factors. You got to figure out what are the exports and imports looking like this week? What's happening in the rest of the world? Is there a war? Are we importing more or less oil? Because, now there's an oil shock. So it was actually a really, really tough thing to do. And you're absolutely right. It's crazy that it had to be done by like a small group of human beings. Now, having said that, if there's one person in the world I would trust to get it right, it is Dr. Rangarajan. But no one should be in the position to actually have to set this rate, right? So after Dr. Rangarajan was the deputy governor, mostly managing the external sector, which is why we talk about him as opposed to the then governor of RBI. There was just hell broke loose, right? So the Congress Socialist Old Guard goes crazy. Then you have the bureaucrats and technocrats going crazy. Of course, the markets are going crazy. And suddenly there is a feeling, remember, this is a minority government with support from outside. Narasimha Rao apparently gets cold feet and thinks that, okay, this is going to be even worse than the Chandrasekhar government. We won't even last a few months. In a few weeks, we'll be gone, right? So apparently he asked Dr. Singh to hold off on the second devaluation. But Dr. Singh said it's already done. And there was, again, that's another lovely story that we can talk about how, Dr. Singh and Rangarajan communicated with each other on how the plane has left or taken off. Like, you can't do anything to bring it back now. So that was step one. But, it makes no sense to just devalue the currency without actually fixing your import-export system, right? Because the point is, you have to be able to earn foreign exchange, which is what got you into this mess in the first place. And to earn foreign exchange, you need to be able to export, right? But to be able to export, you need to remove this labyrinth of crazy licenses and so on. So another part of the reform, which came almost simultaneously, came from P. Chidambaram, which was one, encouraging exports, then there were a number of things like exim scripts. We can talk about, the kinds of incentives they gave. There's import tariffs, which were obviously cut very, very significantly, and rethinking how this trade policy regime is going to function such that if there is more trade, then there is more opportunity to earn foreign exchange. And yes, initially people are going to get crazy and they're going to try and import things that weren't allowed in the erstwhile system. But we will give people a mechanism or trading scripts, to manage those imports and then slowly phase them out and so on and so forth. And that was a really, really important reform.
In fact, a lot of people, even when they comment on the reforms, what they don't realize is how well thought out they were in terms of sequencing. And beforehand, the economists were able to not guess, but they can analyze and see that after this step would be needed because this is what the reaction would be. And there were hardly any unintended consequences and hardly anything that they hadn't already preempted, which is why I think that the reforms succeeded. Today, we see small little things, policy decisions that are taken after every 5 months or 2 months, and sometimes within days, they have to be revisited because our policymakers now act first and think later. They are not able to see, what will happen one step after the other when they take a decision, how the economy will respond. And of course, like you say, it's an HR thing, the personalities, etc. But it's also because these individuals had such great understanding of the economy and economics. They knew what the reaction would be and therefore what needed to be done in the sequence.
Absolutely. And I would add a couple of more small things to that. Once you get past the Econ 101 stage, right, where we mostly study partial equilibriums, right? So you have the downward sloping demand curve, you have the upward sloping supply curve, and you're basically looking at very narrow settings and narrow markets where you're looking at partial equilibrium. But the economy, when we think of it, we need to think about it in general equilibrium terms, right? That is, if you do something in this part of the economy, something's going to pop up in another part of the economy, right? And that, I think, was the greatest strength that people like Dr. Singh, people like, Montek Singh Ahluwalia, Dr. Rangarajan, Rakesh Mohan, these guys truly understood the complexity of an economy. And they weren't like narrow experts who only understood like this one narrow part of economic functioning where they're working off like one partial equilibrium. I think the M document, its success is it's a general equilibrium thinking, right? Whereas most reforms we introduced are partial equilibrium thinking. So I think that's one important distinction. And the second thing, I cannot highlight this enough, is the sequencing, right? So if you think about it, they take office in end of June, right? Everyone's sworn into office. 1st and 3rd of July, the first thing they do is devalue. On July 4th, what's the first thing you do after devaluing? P. Chidambaram was the Minister of State for Commerce because the union minister was not very reforms friendly. The first thing they do is they dramatically reduce tariffs. Because only if you reduce tariffs will your import bill go down, and only if you import can you manufacture enough to export, and all the other things need to start happening. If you just go back before 91 for a second, except for a small list of freely tradable items, the average tariff rate was about 113 or 115%, something like that. And the highest tariff rate was 355%. It was outrageous how costly everything was to import, how impossible it was. So another part of that reform that, Chidambaram announced was they're going to open up the market and remove the restrictions for everything except 71 specified goods, with the understanding that even those will be liberalized over time. But right now, we are going to keep a list of 70. So that's the sequence, right? So now what comes after this? You have, as I said, now suddenly people are going to start importing and exporting. Do we have the capacity for that? So they had a system called canalization. They introduced, these exim scripts, which were literally, they're just vouchers, right? Which you can slowly phase out so that you don't have these crazy fluctuations. And simultaneously, they said, okay, goods and services we are able to buy, but what about foreign technology? So, A.N. Verma and P. Chidambaram, they all coordinated and said that we're going to have foreign technology agreements that will start getting permitted. So that now you can also get foreign technicians, because the next glut is going to be, now we can import the machinery, but who's going to come and install it? Right? Which you need some. So that's, what you said about it being coordinated, thought through, the sequencing, it is so right. It was so, and in high priority sectors, they started allowing foreign equity because you need FDI to come in so that, you can start getting more dollars into the economy and so on and so forth. Now, after this, still the biggest problem, as we discussed in the first part of the conversation, was this crazy industrial licensing system. And just like Montek Singh had put in a lot of work, starting with the VP Singh government and prepared this MDOC and so on, there was another reformer, which is Rakesh Mohan. Again, had gotten his PhD in the US at Princeton, had worked at the World Bank, had come first to the Planning Commission, then the Industry Ministry. And he was advising them. And he actually literally put together a list of every single control. There's a lovely paper written by him and Vandana Arora. From 1950 to 1991, they actually trace every single crazy licensing. And then, when you're tracing this, you have to start understanding, does it make sense? Does it not make sense? What makes sense? So the next thing that was announced, all this was announced in the same month, by the way, in July, right? Between 25th June when they took office to 23rd or 24th July when, the famous budget speech by Manmohan Singh, all this was happening. So this was industrial delicensing. All that crazy stuff about you need a permit, it's going to tell you where to set up the, the location of the bicycle industry, the quantity, how many directors you can appoint, how much employment, all of that was removed in a single stroke. And about 80% of the Indian industry was brought out of this kind of industrial licensing. I think about 18 industries, it was still kept. And there were various reasons for it. And again, with the idea that they will liberalize this eventually. And eventually, the sectors that were reserved for the state, like iron and steel and stuff like that, that was pulled back. The MRTP, which was this monopolies and restrictive trade practices, we didn't talk about that.
And reservations for small scale industries. My God, you're telling companies to remain small. You may become too big for your own good.
Okay, so the reservations, now that we've taken this detour, we must make it. This was eventually eliminated in the Vajpayee government time. But this comes from the Nehruvian times where they said that small firms can't compete with big firms. And big firms are obviously going to invest a lot and try to get scale. And then small firms won't be able to compete. And there are certain things India is good at, cottage industries, shoes, textiles, handicrafts, small parts, spare parts. All those things we should reserve for small scale industry.
Yeah, I always say that's like saying people who play gully cricket, you're not eligible to play international cricket, even if you're very good.
Actually, it's a little bit worse. It is saying that cricket in the 20 over format can only be played as gully cricket. Right? That's effectively what they did, right? So you can never have a 2020 and an IPL and an international 2020 World Cup and all. If it's a 2020 format, it will only be played as gully cricket. And if you played anything other than gully cricket or you put it in a school stadium, you need an additional permit. That's kind of what they were doing. And the reasoning behind it again was that small firms won't be able to compete, which was crazy because we know from the Korean, Taiwanese, Malaysian experience that small firms, actually, that was their biggest strength, that, they were able to utilize labor and local culture and, that tradition of working with the hands for, whether it's a leather shoe or clothing or bespoke tailoring. We never managed to tap into that, right? So, but what that meant was you could never get spare parts, for a bicycle made by a small scale firm because only certain firms could be small. And that reservation list started with, I think, 60 or 70 types of goods. And I think by the late 90s, it had over 1,000 goods included in that reservation list, which was reserved for small scale industry. So this was, anything up to 10 million, right? I mean, that's hardly any money. Rupees, by the way, not even dollars, was supposed to remain small. So small scale, reservation list was delicensed a little bit later, a few years later in Vajpayee's time. And then, of course, the full delicensing came. And then the famous budget speech was the first time a new kind of economic vision had been placed. Right? So like I said before, that cement had been decontrolled in the 80s, sugar was decontrolled. Towards the end of the 80s, you had some minor trade liberalization, you had broadbanding, you had some streamlining. But even then, people kind of held on to this idea that the socialist way was still the correct way. We just need to make some tweaks and turns within that method. And Manmohan Singh's speech is the first time that you say that self-sufficiency doesn't mean socialism. It means the ability to pay your bills without selling your gold, right? And to be self-sufficient, that is for Indian economy to actually be able to pay its own bills and have some value for its currency and serve its own people, you need to be integrated to the rest of the world and global markets and so on, right? So there, the biggest thing he brought in was fiscal discipline, which, as you've tracked, we have even until today. That's kind of baked in now into Indian macroeconomic policy. They eliminated a number of public spending on subsidies and PSUs and, started sort of reducing that expenditure. There was some serious tax reform because, the tax rates were so outrageous and out of whack was, no one was paying taxes. So, you needed to bring in some sanity to actually incentivize people to pay taxes and, be in the formal part of the economy. There was some financial liberalization on how interest rates were set, both by RBI and the banks and, those sorts of things.
National Stock Exchange was set up. The capital controller went away.
Exactly. Capital controller went away. The import-export controller went away. Literally, there was a controls infrastructure which was completely
That
dismantled.
building in Delhi, where the Cottage Emporium is from where it was all controlled.
Exactly. Then they allowed for foreign direct investment. They allowed for technology transfers. There was a plan to start privatizing large public sector organizations and, disinvesting, which has still not been done, but, completely, but it all started then. And of course, deregulation, those sorts of things. So all these were dubbed basically, what was pejoratively dubbed the Washington Consensus, right? By John Williamson. But basically, these were the prescriptions, when the orthodoxy changed on how developing economies are supposed to do their business, it changed through the experience of the Taiwanese, Malaysians, Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea, most importantly, was a miracle economy. And then when China liberalized, the other shoe dropped. And of course, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and stuff, the fundamental orthodoxy in the rest of the world also changed. And that's where all these prescriptions started coming. But, India's reforms were completely homegrown in the sense that they were written by Indians, pursued by Indians. Of course, there's support from IMF, World Bank. Many of the technocrats who did it had actually worked there and, had deep connections there. But it was very much led by the team and, all the people I mentioned. I'm sure I'm leaving out some names, but it was a big team. I encourage people to go look up the 1991project.com and we have all the reformers, their stories, exactly how this happened. I have all those details up there written not just by me, but by a number of people. But it was an extraordinary thing because policy change is not easy. Pooja, you've tracked this, right? You've pointed out how we do ad hoc stuff. We do demonetization. We do retroactive taxation. We do suddenly there'll be like imports on laptops, import licensing for laptops, and then they'll rescind it. We do all this crazy stuff. And one of the most tricky things where the Indian economy could have really become one of those tin pot republic economies where, you just go from crisis to crisis. India has never been in that situation again where it was on the brink of economic collapse and currency crisis. It's never had that kind of crazy, situation where we're running out of reserves or where S&P and Moody's is going to devalue us. And if you notice the Latin American experience or even the South Asian experience, actually, if you look at what happened in Sri Lanka, people who are in this situation keep getting into the situation over and over and over again. And India has never been in that situation since then, which is testament to how well the first stage of reforms were conducted and how well that, stage was set. Now, if all this is getting too serious for people, again, I was only 8 years old, right? I didn't go from like riding bicycles to becoming a very serious person. And, Pooja, even in my own life, I'm sure you observe this in your life. Suddenly, you just had Cadbury and Amul chocolate and you could get like 10 different kinds of chocolate, right? We didn't have Pepsi growing up. We had Thumbs Up and Gold Spot and all. But, Michael Jackson drank Pepsi, who was the coolest thing to do. And suddenly you could drink Pepsi.
Shruti, you mentioned this. I still remember I was in school and there was a trailer for the advertisement for Pepsi when it was to return to India. And the entire conversation in school on that day was about this trailer for the advertisement. And then, then the advertisement would come and then Pepsi would return to it. It was such a big deal. I can't tell you.
Absolutely. No, and it is a huge deal. For us, getting access to something like Pepsi or, getting a cassette of Michael Jackson, which had to be imported, right? To get access to something like that was like getting an iPhone for today's kids. Like it was a really big deal. It was a sort of thing where you waited, you saved money and you waited and you begged your parents. And then the moment you got it, you shared it with all your friends. And then from that one Michael Jackson tape, 15 more tapes would be copied. We all had our own bootleg version of, these albums or these songs. So it was an extraordinary time, but, this was something that really touched everyone's lives. And my favorite example of this, and again, this is, as we grow up and we think back to our lives, I grew up with my grandparents, the ones who had the phone and who would take messages and things. They lived about 10 minutes away, walking distance from us. So we'd spend half our school day there, after school we'd go to Nani's place and, all of that usual stuff. For such a large part of my early childhood, my grandmother every day, just after lunch, before dinner, would sit with one big plate of rice or a big plate of dal, raw rice, raw dal, and start removing all the impurities from it. There were these pathars and kankars, typically. And I saw her doing it for years and we never questioned it because that was just how it was done. And we just assumed, there must be some impurity in it. She's removing it, to have a better meal. And I never realized that this was part of that liberalization moment, that it all went away after that. Because what happened was you had Essential Commodities Act and you were controlling prices for everything, right? Because the economy wasn't large enough. So even middle class people relied on rations and things. Now, when rice gets price controlled, but actually the market price is higher than the control price, what happens is people want to start selling in the black market because that's how the ration shops will make a killing. But if you divert 100% of what goes in the ration shop to the black market, then you're going to have riots, right? People are waiting outside in line, they're going to beat you up. So what they do is the market price adjusts in the sense that the ration price, let's say, is 20% away from the market price. They will reduce 20% of the weight in rice and include 20% of the weight in something that can pass off as rice because it'll add to the weight when you're weighing and measuring and giving a bag of rice to a poor person or to my grandmother or something. So it'll adjust. But when you go home and the grandmother opens that bag, it's still only 80% rice and 20% impurities, except it's all mixed in. So now you need to separate it, right? And the moment liberalization happened, this just went away in a few months or a couple of years. I never saw my grandmother do that ever again in my life. And it's, you just think about this, we're talking nowadays about female labor force participation and how women get trapped at home. Now imagine having to look after a family and raise your kids. And every day you have to spend 2 hours making sure that the dal you're serving them doesn't have stones in them, right? The whole thing, economists, we just call this deadweight loss. But there's a human cost to this, which is so large and so extraordinary. It's very difficult to express this to someone who's never seen it.
And the only little bit that I want to add to it is that, I was at the IMF on their invitation a few years ago in 2014, I think, if I recall correctly. And I cannot tell you, Shruti, the number of people from the senior IMF management who walked up to me and said that, we take India as the poster child of our reforms program, our stabilization programs. And any economy that we go to and we say, you need to do this, we give the example of India. And we say that if you do what we are saying, you'll become like India. That just felt so good.
Absolutely. India became one of those textbook cases or case studies that are taught everywhere in the world. There are two things Indian technocrats have been known to advise the rest of the world on. The first is how we run our elections. So if you remember, recently when Bhutan democratized, when Nepal wanted to figure out how to switch to a different kind of ballot system, literally Indian election officers are called there. They train the election commission of that country. They figure out how to run these elections and so on. Another area is vaccine distribution, right? So the Indian administrative system has figured this out so well that so many African countries, I see Indians going and advising. So anytime I meet, colleagues and friends who are coming from African countries to Washington, D.C., and, D.C. is one of those interesting places where everyone from the world in the policy business kind of goes through, right? They always talk about that incredible experience. And the third area, as you said, is how to figure out macroeconomic stability, which is most important pillar. Under that umbrella, then you have flexibility and room to do so many other things in the economy. You can't start with digital, public infrastructure. You need to have macro stability first before you can do digital public infrastructure. You need macro stability first and sensible method of raising revenue before you start distributing toilets, right? So I'm saying it doesn't matter where you are on the spectrum, whether you are on the left, whether you are on the right, whether you are a centrist. you basically need to be part of an economy that can function and pay bills, right? And for that, you need prudent macroeconomic policy, you need prudent monetary policy, you need prudent fiscal policy. And this came in to India only after 1991. And, for all this talk, again, when I speak with my socialist friends, my communist friends, I also went to Delhi University, so I have all the, the spectrum of ideologies that you get in economic sciences. One of the things I always impress upon them is that India's welfare agenda really took off only after 1991 because the union government revenue has increased about 25 times, right? State government revenues have increased about 25 to 30 times. All this in nominal terms, about, 3.5 to 4.5 times in real terms. And only if you can have revenue with the government can we even have a conversation about should we build schools, should we build hospitals, should we give toilets, right? Should we give fertilizer subsidy? Otherwise, the whole question is moot. You have no money to distribute. So even those who are not your typical free market types, I think this liberalization case study as it is, we really need to think carefully about it, because at the core of it, it wasn't about are we ideologically socialists or markets or whatever. At the core of it, it was how do we grow the size of the pie, right? How do you achieve economic growth? Because without economic growth, you can't have any of this. And for economic growth, you need to go back to what, Adam Smith said, law and order, a dispensation of justice, a tolerable taxation. And that's pretty much all you need, right? Now we've added a few more sophisticated things like currencies and macro stability and controlling fiscal deficits and, prudent policies. But that's really at the core of it. And in your book, actually, the reason I enjoy reading your work so much is you and I grew up in that time and with that optimism. And in your book, it's so clear what we lost, right? I mean, it's literally called the lost decade, but what we lost when we lost the momentum to continue those set of reforms. Because even till the end of the Vajpayee government, till 2004, right, even though it was not a Congress government, they just continued those reforms, and then Manmohan Singh became Prime Minister again. After acquiring independence and, setting up a constitution and an election commission and so on, I think the next greatest thing we've done in, post-colonial India is the 91 reforms.
Thanks so much, Shruti. That's so well put.
Thank you for having me. This was a pleasure. And hopefully we get to have more conversations about what came after and all the geeky things that happened.
The story is incomplete.
The story is incomplete. Picture abhi baki hai, mere dost.
Picture abhi baki hai. Let me end this episode by recommending a list of books that I like on the 1991 reforms, and I keep rereading several times. The first on this list is Jairam Ramesh's To the Brink and Back. Ramesh was an officer on special duty in Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao's office for the period of the reforms. Montek Singh Ahluwalia's Backstage is next on this list. Ahluwalia executed the reforms as Commerce Secretary and Finance Secretary later, and was the author of the famous M document that was the blueprint of the reforms. He worked with Prime Ministers V.P. Singh and Chandrasekhar and tried to persuade them too to do the reforms, but they didn't do them. Third on this list is Rakesh Mohan's India Transformed. Mohan was an economic advisor in the industry ministry and had studied and written about internally in government about the license and permit Raj. This became the basis for its dismantling. Fourth on my list is C. Rangarajan's Forks in the Road, My Days at RBI and Beyond. Rangarajan was the RBI governor during the time of the reforms. The reforms officially started with the devaluation of the rupee that he had implemented. After you've read these, go for Professor Suresh Tendulkar and Professor Bhavani's Understanding Reforms Post-1991 India. This is a slim book, but it's best read after you have a good idea about the reforms. I would say it's the most important book to read for understanding reforms. Also read Strictly Personal by Daman Singh, who is Manmohan Singh's daughter and originally a critic of his reforms. In this book, she has reported conversations with Dr. Singh done towards the end of his first term as Prime Minister. The chapters on his years in the RBI, in Planning Commission and in Finance Ministry in different stints are very insightful.
You've been listening to How India's Economy Works, hosted by journalist and author Pooja Mehra. Do stay connected with more of our coverage at The Core. You can check out our website or sign up to our newsletter at www.thecore.in. That is www.thecore.in. Do also track us on LinkedIn, where we usually post synopses or extracts of our top stories and interviews. We would love your feedback, so do write to us at feedback@thecore.in. Thank you for listening.